Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is going to wrap up Unit 1. So we are finally making our way out of Unit 1, and eventually, next couple days, we'll be in Unit number 2. So the last couple topics that we need to cover for Unit 1 are food chains, food webs, and trophic levels. I don't know why they kind of separate this up into different topic numbers because they're all kind of interrelated to me. So I'm going to kind of cover all these sort of in the same PowerPoint. Um, some of this stuff I think is pretty easy. It's kind of middle school science stuff. There is a little bit of math at the end of this. So you may want to have a calculator to use, specifically a scientific calculator. If you don't have one, they've got really good apps for them. I have one on my phone. It's called Real Calc. There's my phone, Real Calculator, Real Calc, whatever. Just download that one. It's a really good scientific calculator app, but whatever. All right, now, in the previous videos, we talked a little bit about producers and their role, in the ecosystem. Obviously, their role is to photosynthesize and produce glucose not only for themselves but for other organisms. But we also have consumers, right? So we're probably familiar with some of these terms. Carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores. A couple pictures here of each one of those. But consumers all fall under the same category of what we call a heterotroph. So again, these are organisms that are incapable of photosynthesis and they have to obtain food. A bear, has to eat fish. They can also eat plants, I guess. A shark obviously is a carnivore. A cow would definitely be what we call a herbivore. They just eat, grass, and the bear would probably be an omnivore. They can kind of eat both. So again, just be kind of familiar with the terminology there, but that shouldn't be too difficult. Here's a few more terms of some organisms. If we're going to get into food webs and food chains, you probably should understand some of these terms. These are all examples of pretty essential components of a food web or a food chain: detritivores, scavengers, and decomposers. So let's kind of understand the difference between the three. So we're going to start here with the term detritivore. And a detritivore is basically any organism that eats dead stuff, okay, non-living organic matter. These dung beetles here are really good examples of detritivores. They're usually smaller organisms, usually insects. Earthworms maybe would be considered a detritivore. They eat things like poop, waste matter, leaf litter, dead bodies. They would break those things down, but they would use them as a food source. That's kind of the thing that sets them apart. Is these dung beetles that are rolling around this piece of poop here, they actually are going to eat that. That's actually their food. So that's kind of what kind of gives them their own little category. A scavenger is basically a big detritivore. A vulture is a really good example. Vultures will swoop down, on, let's say, an antelope carcass, after it's been picked through by a bunch of lions, and whatever's left over, these guys are going to eat for their food. So again, they're eating dead things that have already been, kind of consumed by other organisms. But in this case, the turkey vulture or the vulture is going to act as a scavenger. But these two things are pretty much the same. The only difference really is the size of the organism. So we kind of use these two words sort of synonymously. And then we have decomposers. Now, decomposers don't actually eat uh, the organic material. They're just kind of breaking it down into smaller particles. So bacteria and funguses are kind of the ones that primarily do that. But really, I mean, in any ecosystem, you're going to have a little bit of all of these things. You're going to have some decomposers that live in the soil, for example, like bacteria and fungi. You're going to have some detritivores. You're going to have probably a scavenger or two in the area. But all of these are kind of components of most food chains and food webs. So that leads us to a food chain. So here's an example of one here. If we kind of start over here on the left, food chains always start with a producer. So in this case, the flour is the producer. And then we have an organism that strictly feeds on that producer. So that would be a caterpillar. In this case, caterpillars just eat the flower. They just eat the plant. So they would be the primary or the first consumer. And then we have a secondary consumer. This will be the frog. The frog eats the caterpillar, amongst other things. They probably could eat other things too, but in this chain of events, this frog would be the secondary consumer. Then we have a snake, which would eat the frog. I suppose the snake could probably also eat the caterpillars, but this would be a tertiary consumer. And then we have, in some cases, we have another level. Not every food chain goes this high, but these would be called quaternary consumers. The owl, for example, would swoop down and eat the snake. All right, so this particular food chain has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels to it. Not every food chain does. In fact, some food chains only have 2 or 3 levels. Just kind of depending on the ecosystem and how many organisms there are. But make sure we're familiar with terms like primary, secondary, tertiary, that type of thing. Here we have a food web. Now, a food web is basically just a whole bunch of food chains just kind of entangled together. So, for example, we can look at this scene. Let's say this is a savanna in Africa somewhere. You probably recognize some of the animals. Well, again, we can start down here with the grasses. That would be a producer. If you look at the arrows are always pointing to the next trophic level. So, for example, the zebra, which would eat the grasses, that would be a primary producer, or I should say a primary consumer. And then there's an arrow pointing away, to the lion. The lion, in this case, would be a secondary consumer. So I mean, right there, you have a nice little food chain, within our food web. Now you'll also notice that there's another arrow leading away from the zebra. This is the hyena. So the hyena and the lion, I suppose you would probably say they're in competition with each other, right, for this resource. All right, but you also see in this video, some scavengers and some detritivores and some decomposers. For example, here you have an earthworm. Earthworms would be considered, I suppose, some type of a decomposer. I would probably consider them more of a detritivore personally, but whatever. You got a dead wildebeest here. So here's your vulture. That would be a scavenger. So again, you see some of those different things that make up the food web. But all in all, you've got a lot of stuff going on here. There's multiple food chains that make up this food web. You should be able, when you see a picture like this, you should be able to, pick, one primary consumer, from this picture. You should be able to pick a producer, pick a secondary consumer, that type of thing. If there are any tertiary or quaternaries, can you choose one from the picture? So be familiar with that. All right, couple more things here. Energy flow. So as we go from, let's say, the producer to the consumer, to the secondary consumer, etc., energy is flowing through the food chain. So we have a rule here. It's called the 10% rule. And it strictly says that only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is transferred to the next. So that means that 90% of the energy from one trophic level is lost. It's usually just lost as heat or something, but I mean only 10% of it gets transferred over. And this is all because of something called the second law of thermodynamics, which basically just says that when energy is transferred from one object to the next, some of that energy gets lost in the process of the transfer. But anyway, just kind of understand that this 10% rule is just saying that only about 10% of the energy gets transferred. So if we're looking, for example, at this food chain, here we have our producer, right, flowers. Here we have our primary consumer, grasshoppers, I suppose. Your secondary would be these little field mice. Then the tertiary might be a hawk. Okay. But if you kind of look at these numbers represent amounts of energy that are available at each level. And the unit there, the J, you probably remember that from chemistry class. That's the joule. A joule is a unit of energy, Joule. But if we kind of look here at the very bottom, it says we have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. So let's say that this is a field or something, or some ecosystem, wherever. This is how much sunlight is available to those producers. Okay, but you might remember from our video on primary productivity, only about 1% of that energy actually is absorbed by those producers, right? So if you've got 1,000,000 joules of energy, 10% of 1,000,000 is 10,000. So there's only about a 1% carryover, from how much available sunlight there is to how much of that energy is actually absorbed by those plants. So we've got 10,000 joules of energy here, that exist amongst those plants. But again, only 10% of that is going to carry over to the next level. So 10% of 10,000 is 1,000 joules. So you have only 1,000 joules of energy available for the grasshoppers. Then you only have 100 joules of energy, for the field mice. Then you only have 10 joules of energy for the hawks. So you can see that as you go up the pyramid, see how it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's because there's less and less energy available. You can kind of imagine why there's probably a heck of a lot more grasshoppers in a field than there might be hawks, right? Because each level is associated with a certain amount of energy, and the higher up you go, there's less and less energy to support individuals. So this is another reason why, food chains usually don't get past 4 or 5 levels. You don't see food chains that have like 12 trophic levels because there's just not enough energy to go through all those, right? So, pyramid, this is what we call a pyramid of energy. This one here is kind of along the same lines, but it's a pyramid of numbers. So instead of like energy, we're like looking at like the actual numbers of organisms. So let's say this is kind of a pond or a lake ecosystem. You've got about 12,000 aquatic plants. That would be your producer level. Then right above that, you've got your fly larvae, about 1,800, 1,900 or so fly larvae. So there's a considerable less amount. Then you've got your bluegills, 316. Then you've got your largemouth bass. So, we're going from producer, primary consumer, secondary, tertiary. But I mean, as the amount of energy decreases, the amount of individuals decreases. So, like this pyramid shape of numbers is kind of related to a pyramid of energy. They're similar, but one is showing us numbers, the other one is showing us actual energy values. So let's kind of take a look at it. It's kind of an example of this. You look at a little bit of some calculations that you might have to do. Again, over here on the left, this is our food chain. We'll start with grass. This is our producer. Grass to field mice to snakes, snakes to hawks. Right. So we're just kind of going up the food chain as we go through this. So let's start off with grass. At that level, let's just say that this is the amount of energy. Now, this is a little bit of a different unit. It's kilocalories. Kilocalories and joules they both measure the same thing. But this just says that we have 100,000 kilocalories of energy, that can be transferred to the next level. Now you'll notice that I've written this in two different ways. This is standard notation. This is scientific notation. They both mean the same thing. It says however you want to punch it in your calculator or however you want to write it on paper or type it in. It doesn't really matter. But again, this amount of energy can be transferred to the field mice. But remember the 10% rule, right? It says about 10% of that energy will be transferred. Now, over here in the middle column, it says that this energy this energy transfer has an efficiency of about 12%. So it's not necessarily always 10%, even though the rule is 10%. It can vary. It can be 11, it can be 12, it can be 9, but it's usually around 10%. So if we're going to figure out how much that energy is going to get transferred, all you have to do is take 100,000, right? That's how much energy was up here. Multiply it by 0.12, right? That's the efficiency value as a decimal. And you get 12,000 kilocalories. So that's how much energy now is available to those field mice. Of course, you can always punch it in this way as well. So if you're using a scientific calculator, you can punch in 1 exponent 5 instead of 100,000, times 1.2, exponent -1 instead of 0.12. Regardless, you get the same answer. 12,000 kilocalories is the same thing as 1.2 times 10 to the fourth kilocalories. So either one of these is acceptable. So now we go to the next level, right? Field mice to snakes. That's a 40% efficient transfer. So you take your 12,000 calories from the previous trophic level, you multiply it by 0.14. In this case, you get 1,680 kilocalories. And again, you can do it in scientific notation if you want to as well. And then, of course, the next step, the efficiency transfer to the hawks is about 8% efficient. And in this case, again, you just take your 1680 for the previous step, multiply it by 0.08, you get 134 kilocalories. All right, so again, it doesn't really matter how we punch this in. If you want to do it scientific, you want to do it standard, you're going to get roughly the same answers no matter what. All right, what I want us to understand about this is that it doesn't always have to be a 10% transfer, but it's usually around there. All right, if I don't give you these numbers, you can go ahead and assume that it's 10%. Okay. All right, that's going to do it for this video. There will be a lecture note review on this as well in Buzz, so make sure we work on that. All right, guys, have a good day. I will see you soon.